Angličtina. A ty to počúvaj.
Teraz počujem vás.
Akože angličtina by to mala byť, hej?
Vypnite sa.
With the Slovak Innovation Slido, which is here with us, so you can feel free to vote. We'll show the results sometime in the middle when you expect Serbia and Montenegro to join the EU. I'd like to ask the presidents this question as well, but yes, and also we will be quite tight for time, so please do submit some questions via Slido. You will be also welcome to upvote other people's questions, so they will appear in a hierarchy of which questions are preferred. So you just need to go to slido.com and put in hashtag globsec2019 and we'll be away. So I will remind anyone that's just joined us that there is translation. Channel 1 will be in English, Channel 2 will be Serbian and Albanian. And for those of you, we will also take questions from the audience. I think there was a good amount of brevity. Questions are short interrogative statements that end with a question mark. I'll just like to remind you about that. So with that, well, maybe we can start with President Đukanović, who didn't get to speak as much as President Vučić in the previous panel. First, maybe I'd ask you to answer the question that we've put up in the poll. And I'd also like to ask you about a recent interview, or several recent interviews you've done, where you've been saying that Moscow, through its politics, and Beijing, through its loans, are trying to prevent the NATO and EU expansion in the Balkans, meaning that the region needs to be the zone of the EU's responsibility and its strategic interest. And you said that unless the EU realizes that, its own future is in jeopardy. Yet, in Montenegro, a Chinese loan to build part of a highway from the port of Bar to Belgrade has sent your country's debt soaring, and it's forced the government to raise taxes, partially freeze public sector wages, and end benefit to mothers, which resulted in some protests. And your courts recently sentenced 2 Russian nationals for plotting a coup against you. So, is there really a plan B for Montenegro, besides the EU?
There is no plan B. Montenegro has paved its path of European Euro-Atlantic integration. We have become members of NATO, and we are much advanced in comparison to other aspiring countries when it comes to the path towards European Union. All of these things that you said are true. I warned clearly that the Balkans should be, or has to be, the zone of primary responsibility of Euro and Euro-Atlantic community, because we are geographically part of Europe and because we are a part of Euro-Atlantic system of values. I don't think anybody else should be convinced into that. Now everybody is aware of that. And I said that there are new players in the geopolitical scene and that we have to open our eyes and accept that the first stage of the geopolitical infrastructure has been finished, and it happened when the Berlin Wall collapsed. And now we have the end of the second stage, where we had one superforce, and now we are starting the third stage. And if we do not open our eyes wide, we will be very surprised, unpleasantly. Russia, China, and the others are seeking their place and their position in the Balkans. And how much of that they will get depends on how much European Union and NATO will give them. And that's why I would like to invite European Union and NATO to do their job in our region. Stop repeating only that the door is open. Because if we wanted to accept that kind of invitation, we would have already been in. But we don't go to the doors usually from our region, but we go with our heads through the wall, and we pay very high price. We lag behind Europe in terms of the living standard. Today, we need a clear policy of incentives for the Western Balkans to go through the door which is open. And the second question, it is true that we took the loan to build the highway. I could give you more details, but I don't have enough time. But we didn't have any room to choose any other offer, because the offer that we got from the Chinese partners was so much more favorable, we couldn't do anything else. But that is a part of what I described earlier. Why weren't we offered such solutions, such bid from European Investment Bank or EBRD? Why didn't we get such favorable conditions from them? Why did we get it from Chinese partners? Because China is taking the space, taking the room that Europe leaves empty. And the third thing, when it comes to public debt, we are still below 70%. It is above 60% defined in the Maastricht Agreement, but since it is below 70% of the GDP, it means that it is below of the public debt of 2/3 of the countries from European Union. So we shouldn't be emphasizing this for the European Union. And it is true that recently we have the first instance judgment in the court proceedings related to the attempted violent coup in Montenegro in October 2016. The idea was to stop our progress towards NATO membership. Some people whose IDs show that they are members of certain state structures in Russia were involved, and we did not make any judgment about whether Russia as the state is directly involved or not, because we do not have clear evidence for the court proceedings, and we don't need that. We have evidence, clear evidence that these people with those IDs participated in that plot, and it's logical that they are convicted.
Continue a bit in the same vein. I was paging through the recent progress report for Serbia, written by that came out from the EU, which says that Serbia needs to progressively align its foreign and security policy with the EU's common foreign and security policy in the period up to accession. And then I saw yesterday, 2 days ago, in the news the official announcement that Belgrade is planning to sign in October the free trade agreement with the Eurasian Economic Union. So I would like to ask you, I know we have two of the tallest presidents in Europe probably sitting on the stage, but for how long will you be able to stand on two tables, swing from two branches, play two pianos? I don't know which, there's been so many of these metaphors going on for the last few years. So is this a sign that you're worried about the European project, that it will collapse, or that Serbia may eventually not make it?
No. No, I know that you don't like me to speak too much, and I'll take care of your interests, which means that Serbia has been negotiating that trade agreement with Eurasian Alliance for 10, 12 years, and now we're gonna get a very important license to export our cheese to Russia and to Belarus, which is very important for us, and I'm proud to confirm that. On the other hand, we are on our EU path, and it has nothing in common. We are not going to be a part of Eurasian Association. We are going to be a part of EU if someone would like to see us within EU in the future, and that's it. We have good relationship with Russia, we have good relationship with China. Taking a lot of loans from China and from EIB, EBRD and all the others, we also succeeded to cut our public debt from 78% of GDP ratio to 50%. We cut an unemployment rate from 26% to 11.7%. We have a surplus in our budget for the 4th year in a row, which has been the case in only 3 EU member states. I'm not saying that we are living in a paradise, we are still a very poor country, but we are doing better and better, and we'll do everything that we can to improve living standard of our people. And if you ask me whether we're gonna conclude more arrangements either with Russia, either with China, for the sake of our people, yes, we're gonna do it. And no one can stop us in that. Are we going to say before Russian president that our strategic goal is to be a part of European Union and to fulfill European integration process demands? Yes, I will always do it, and will always say that face to face to Vladimir Putin. and to mention it once again, as many of EU leaders don't do when they meet him. They do it when they leave Moscow or when Putin leave their capitals, but they don't do it tete-a-tete.
Thanks. Nice to have a window into your private chats with Mr. Putin. Your Excellency,
Yes,
Zaharia.
I met him so far 15 times, and I'm planning 16, sorry, and I'm planning to meet him very soon again. And I'll inform you about it.
Oh, great. I look forward to the message. Your Excellency, Ms. Zaharieva, last year in Sofia, Bulgaria hosted the first EU-Balkan summit since the 2003 Thessaloniki summit, where the EU promised a clear accession perspective for the Western Balkans countries. What else is Bulgaria specifically doing to help the countries in the region? And what can they learn from your recent accession experience?
Thank you. First of all, I really appreciate always the possibility to talk about the Balkans, Western Balkans, not only because they are our neighbors, but I think that we share on the Balkans, and the previous panel shows how complicated is everything on the Balkans, but we share common history, we share common values, we are friends, neighbors, and Bulgaria it's among the member states, European member states, which really, without any hidden agenda, want to see all 6 Western Balkans countries in, I would say, a near future or a medium-term future, became a part of European family. And it was first presidency of Bulgaria in the beginning of 2018. And one of our main priority was European perspective and connectivity of the Western Balkans countries. And it's not the policy that Bulgaria will continue only 6 months. It's our long strategic goal. And I thank the 2 presidents who are here for receiving me before the presidency, give me opportunity to listen what they think that Europe should do to confirm the European perspective of the Western Balkans countries. And because it's two-side process, it's not one-side play. So European Union should, I think, not organize once per 15 years and meet the leaders of the Balkans with all the European leaders, but consistently support European integration of the Western Balkans. It's a process. It's a difficult one. You mentioned our integration process. It was painful. The reforms sometimes are painful, but trust me, all the reforms that we implement before accession were for good. So we continue after our presidency to be one of the most strongest supporter. We organize meetings, forums, delivering expertise to our friends on the Western Balkans, and of course continue to convince more enlargement skeptical European member states that it's a win-win process. And as the presidents mentioned, they are in Europe. Actually, some of them are closer to Bulgaria to some of the most enlargement skeptical countries. And they are not somewhere far away. And I fully believe that European projects will be not complete without European Western Balkans became a member state.
Thank you very much. Ms. Brego, the RCC really focuses a lot on regional connectivity, regional relations, and for years this has also been a very important strategic priority of the EU, but there remain so many barriers to the free movement of people and goods. You know, together in the region, the countries have more than 17 million inhabitants, a market the size of the Netherlands, but their economies generate only about the same as much as Slovakia, which has a population a third of the size. So what are some of the most important barriers to regional connectivity, both tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers, and what are the trends? For instance, in Trieste in 2017, there was a big summit during which there was announced there would be a regional youth cooperation council that's set up in Tirana. But yesterday or 2 days ago, some of my friends sent me a message that it's clinically dead, and they're saying that actually the regional cooperation trend is not improving. So what's your perspective on that?
Well, I wouldn't really dare to say that the regional cooperation is not moving ahead. Otherwise, so I'm not going to have a job, and I think that no one's role is to be seated here if that one is going to be true. Well, but let me start not informally to thank the GlobeSec organizers for offering this chance to one of the most challenging agendas of the region. So I think for all of us to succeed in a near future on our Europeanization or transformation of the region, the regional cooperation is one of the utmost reforms and agendas to be alive and kicking. When I started my tenure in office, I traveled everywhere in the region, and I met President Vučić, I met President Đukanović, and everybody else out of the six. And frankly, we could be hell-bent as an organization to promote and facilitate regional cooperation. But our success is definitely the success of the economies of the region. So said it differently, we can't do anything if rancor, bitterness, conflict, and if negotiations would be tooth and claw. But definitely the situation is different today in the region. You mentioned Trieste, then we had the Sofia summit. Well, I do hope that it's not going to take as long as it took from 1999 when the Stabilization Association process was introduced to the region, because I think that now we need to step up. And I have to commit myself, and I'll pull no punches on that. I think that we need to move now for both of us, be it Western Balkans and European Union as well, from the geopolitics of nice speeches and approaches to the real geopolitics. Unless Western Balkans will join European Union will never be considered full. We are not only joined together by geography or history, even that history in the Balkans have been quite different in the last 20 years, but we are jointly moving together, and we have to as partners. And I do trust and believe that if there is something concrete that might happen in the region, is the transformation and reconciliation through the economic development. And on that one, definitely, we have some good figures to show. But, you know, in Balkans is always colorful, so there are a lot of paradoxes living alive in there. So while there are more than 700,000 people employed during the last 5 years, and while there is an increase in trade with exports with EU in the last 10 years, 146%, we can't really give nice figures about the intra-trade among ourselves. But on the other hand, there are some nice figures in the region. So if you'll go and read and then check the public opinion and that of the business, you'll feel that there are a lot of paradoxes. But still, business community are quite positive about the development of the region. 61% of them, they do have trust that the economic situation is on the right way. If you ask the citizens of the Balkans, their perception is more gloomy than that of the business community. But then it speaks a lot on the need for the regional cooperation. One figure, for the very first time after 4 years, the citizens of the Western Balkans, 56% of them think that European perspective is something that will work for good in changing their lives. But 74% of them, they are trustful that regional cooperation is going to do it faster and better.
Excellent. Wow. Well, after those statistics, maybe we should check our recently generated ones via the poll. I'm actually quite curious to see, and then we will go to some Slido questions. Okay. Okay. I'm not really sure how we should interpret these statistics, but I will leave it to the presidents. But I will go first to my, yes, here we go. We have a couple of great questions, and I think maybe we should ask Milena Lazarevic. For the presidents, if full EU accession is impossible to achieve midterm due to opposition within the EU, would you accept a partial or reduced membership as a start? Who wants to take that first?
Milo, to je za tebe.
As the front runner, nominal front, you should maybe take it first, Mr. President Đukanović.
Sa zadovoljstvom.
With pleasure. Well, I think that we should continue with consistent implementation of the strategy of unification of Europe. I think that without any doubt, we should make credible that all the countries of the Western Balkans have their prospects in the European Union, in the long run at least. Everything else would be a policy that is not good. I don't think that we should create any shortcuts for anybody to become a member of the European Union without meeting the standards and doing the reforms before that. But I would like to warn that the European Union has to take into account the the reform process and geopolitical aspects and adoption of standards. These are all the facets of this issue. So I don't expect anybody to say you will be a member at certain time, but I expect even less them to tell us you wouldn't be members in the following 5 years, or enlargement is not on the agenda because we have to deal with the consolidation. That is wrong. That is the invitation for everyone who would like to take the Western Balkans on the wrong path and ensuring that the Balkans just actually lose time and tries to deal with certain alternative perspectives, and I don't see any alternative for us. I see that there are penetrations of interests of third parties in the Western Balkans, and that's the attempt of the destruction of European prospects of the Western Balkans, and that is actually the attempt of trying to destroy European system of values and unified Europe. There is no alternative offer. I do not like monopolies. And I would like to hear alternatives, but there are no alternatives. You can't hear proper alternative. We don't have it. And if European Union does not react, and if European Union does not recognize that it is its own interest to continue enlargement of the Western Balkans immediately, then European Union has to be aware that they are taking the responsibility for letting their priority interest zones to the countries that come with the platforms that are opposite to the system of value of European Union.
Question, and since I know you're a man for facts and figures, I wonder if you would also respond to the poll. I would like to add one more mini question that I think Matt asked, but I don't know if it was fully answered, about as we wait for the decision of the member states on North Macedonia and Albania, how that might affect your speed and insistence to reach a deal with Kosovo. Sorry, that was too many questions, but...
Speaking about North Macedonia and Albania, we would always vote for them in favor of their interests. Full stop. And I was one of the very rare guys that supported Edi Rama at that very tough discussion in Sofia summit, which happened a year ago. And it was not an easy day for Edi Rama and Albania. Would always do the same. It would be good news for them, for their citizens. At least they would get some hope, which is good for them. And what is good for them is always good for us. Speaking about these figures, well, it's not a representative sample. I think that if there would be a representative sample, it would be more % on that never side, and less on that 20-25. Our job is to do things, and for us, as you know, the biggest hurdle is Kosovo, although we need to do many things regarding rule of law in particular, because on economy side there were no remarks from European Commission on Serbia, and it was all about rule of law, work of our parliament, and I don't know what else. But the most important and the biggest part of European Commission report, and it's not only that, it's there to say all about it, it's what we're going to do with Kosovo and what we're going to do with Pristina regarding our negotiating process. And just to add one word, Mr. Djukanovic was speaking about possible alternatives. We don't have an alternative, but I would refer to Melinda's words. I think that we need to stick to each other much stronger than it used to be, that we need to find, that's why I'm always advocating possible arrangement between Belgrade and Pristina. Because if we do so as a block of territories or countries or different nations, we can do many things much better than we do it today. And because there is another factor that it's not up to us and it's not dependent on us, and that's a desire of EU countries. There is nothing that Mr. Djukanovic or myself that we can do with the wishes of French or German citizens. And I just want to inform you that I'll speak to Angela Merkel tomorrow morning. If I'm going to inform you about my talks with Putin, I'll do the same with my talks with Merkel. And it's up to them. And before that, we need to do something for our citizens. I think that there are a lot of barriers that we should put down, and that's what we're going to do together with North Macedonia. We're going to do one-stop shop at our border, which is very important, and I met Prime Minister Zaev on that issue, spoke to Pendarovsky on that issue as well, and I think that we'll put that in place within 2 months, and then we're going to do the same with all the other neighbors, and that is going to be a good step forward. We'll try to do absolutely the same with Milo and with Bosnia. That would be very important for us. That will cut our operational costs. That will do good for our economies. And to tell you the truth, we are ready to do in the future customs union. We would equalize all subsidies and incentives that we provide to possible investors, because that would be the way to create unique market. And I know that many people would see that as a sort of substitution for European Union. I don't care how do you see it. I think it's something of the biggest importance for our region. We can stay on our EU path. If you want us, take us. If you don't want us, we should take care of ourselves. And if we create a sort of regional economic zone, a block of countries and territories that will fight for themselves, I think that we can have twice bigger or 3 times bigger growth rates in the future. Last year we had 4.5% growth rate. This year it's going to be, I dare to say today, 3.7, 3.8, and we are not satisfied with that. But it's going to be, as you know, in first 5, 6 countries in an entire Europe, which is not bad, which means that in next 10, 15 years we can get closer to EU living standards. But yes, all of us would like to see our countries as part of EU. That's what is Milo's wish, that's what is my wish, but it's not. There are many things that are up to us, but it's not a case that everything's up to us, and we have to be aware of that, and that's it.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open up to some audience questions. I'm sure that there are a number of people with burning questions. Okay. Let's see where the closest mic is. Perhaps it's close to Milan there, and then I will promise that we will kind of go around the room and come this way. So maybe if there's a mic there, can we get one?
Are you sure, Valerie, you want to start with me? Milan Nič, DGAP, Berlin. To 2 presidents, President Djukanovic, when I had an honor to host you in Berlin, I asked you the question that you are a president of the country and also a chairman of your party. And there's a congress of your party in the autumn, and I ask you if you will step down as a chairman of the party to be president. I would address the same question to President Vučić, who is also leader of the party. But let me have a tough question for you. I had one for President Tači. Now, We are in a country where a journalist was murdered last year, which triggered huge protests in Slovakia. But the murder was investigated, and those who did it are in prison. Huge protests in your country were initiated by a brutal attack on the opposition politician in November, Borko Stefanovic. Some people accused you of instigating violence on the opposition, and the best answer to show that this is not true would be to investigate that attack. Is that attack investigated? And are the perpetrators in prison?
Thank you. We can have the answers first so that we don't get distracted by other questions.
Da, veoma kratko.
Tek 30 godina vlast.
U ovom trenutku
At this moment, unfortunately, I cannot give you a specific answer. That is the topic that we will discuss in our party within the following 6 months in the preparation of the Congress. But I would like to confirm the following. We are aware of the good practice of European democracy. We know that. And we want to adopt that practice as fast as possible in every possible segment of our society that will be beneficial for the further democratic prosperity of Montenegro. Our societies do have certain specific features, and those are specific features that we have to take into account. If it weren't for that, we would probably have less disputable parts of our practice, and we would have less suspicion from Europe. We have to know very well what are the specific features of economic and democratic and cultural development of our region. So in that context, we will consider carefully the question that you asked. Unfortunately, although I would really like to, I can't give you a specific answer to that question.
That's the reason why Milo is in power for 30 years. Smartest possible reaction. Your second question. We almost immediately arrested those guys, detained those guys, and there is an ongoing trial. And it happened a year ago. And I was lectured by thousands of people that in Serbia would be the first country in which some journalists would be killed or wounded. And after that, in let's say at least 6 EU countries that happened, and some non-EU countries that happened, but nothing similar happened in Serbia. Anyway, we always punish all those guys that are using violent methods, and we'll carry on with that. Speaking about number of people that were protesting, I need to tell you that I'm very satisfied about the tone of the protests. Even though from time to time those protests turned violent, we haven't arrested almost none of them, unlike it happens in many other European countries. They are free to gather, free to rally, free to express their will, and I'm very proud of that. And speaking about their influence on Serbian public audience, although my numbers and numbers of my party have recently dropped because of that Kosovo discussion in the parliament, and I was seen as a traitor in a way of Serbian national interests, still we have, let's say, 4 to 4.5 times more votes than the others. And it shows that Serbian people are determined to listen and to the real things and to accept the reality, not the dreams of some people. But I do share your worries, and I hope that in all the other countries would be done everything in the same manner that was done regarding that issue in our country. And
Thank you.
Of course we need to do many other things to improve an environment for free journalism and freedom of expression and many other things, and I'm not running away from that issue. We'll have to tackle it in a more serious way. And speaking about that question that you Okay.
I'm sure you would like to answer maybe another round of questions where we have only 4 minutes left, probably less, so I hate to interrupt you, but I also do not want to have the audience upset with me for not having a chance to answer questions. So we had a question over here, just one more. This is the last one.
Valerie, everybody's amazed with your energy.
Matthew Roach, George C. Marshall Center. The populations of Southeast Europe are forecast to decline by 20% or more by the middle of this century. What does that trend mean for your countries, and what can your governments or the RCC do to address it?
It's the most difficult issue for all of us, and it is really happening and harming all of us. And you wouldn't believe it that it's even worse in some EU countries from our region, including Croatia and Bulgaria. And it's not easy to tackle that issue. We are doing some measures, but before everything, we need to improve our economies, living standards of our people, then to offer something else for that is not easy to find, but European perspective is one of the key solutions for our countries. That's what I can say in a very brief way.
Također, kratak komentar.
Just a brief comment. Reputation of our region is very clear and very famous. We are in an unstable region, and that permanent instability comes from the lack of tolerance towards diversity that exists in the region. And my belief, my deep belief, is that the inspiration to the intolerance and instability comes from our lagging behind in terms of economic development. So if we want to deal with the roots of the problem, we have to start from the economic development. That's why it is important that Alexander said that we have to keep the European prospects very clear. And the second thing is, it is not important when we will become members of the European Union, but it is the most important to use in a smart manner the time before we become members. And this time should be used by European Union and us. And we will do the best if we connect us through infrastructure with Europe. And in that way, we will actually answer the question of China and Russia and the others. But we will also make the European prospects for the region very clear in such a way through infrastructural connections. And the second thing is we have to improve knowledge. That is one of the key challenge that we have in our region. But if we are smart, and if we do the policy of Europeanization and we work on these issues in a smart way, I'm sure that the region will overcome its basic weakness, and that in this way we will clearly make the European prospects clear and foreseeable for all the citizens in the region.
How's the ire of the audience by saying the only thing we have time left for is for 2 more closing statements from the ladies on the panel. It's a rare panel in my patch of the world that I cover that is a 50-50 gender balance, but it doesn't matter if we don't let you speak. So please, Ms. Zaharieva, briefly, if you may.
Just 2-3 sentences. In the beginning of 90s, after the changes, only for 2 or 3 years, 900,000 Bulgarians leave Bulgaria. The state was bankrupt. The situation was not as is now in Venezuela, but it was very close. Of course, it's difficult to recover so fast when so many people, we were 8 million, now we are around 7 in Bulgaria, living in Bulgaria, leave the country for so short period. But since our membership, and we increased the incomes in last 5 years by 85%, the salaries, 85% for 5 years. Our GDP grows so fast, so this is the way the Bulgarians to start to come back in Bulgaria, and they did. So I fully agree with the presidents. How we can keep the people on the Balkans is by giving them a clear perspective for the future. And it's not only economic development, it's a matter of connectivity, freedom, and justice.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry, but it's not my decision here. Ms. Prego, you have the final words, sentences.
Well, I'm delighted so, but, well, I'll give only 2 short sentences. I do believe and I trust that the fight against poverty and economic growth in the region will definitely improve the situation. And yes, there are worrisome figures, more than 13% of the brain drain this year, which is quite in a rise from the last year. But I do believe as well that we need to transform our institutions. And for a sustainable development in the region, I think that the European perspective should be kept alive. If I were you, and sorry for saying that, I wouldn't have put that question of which date of membership do you see as the most, let's say, plausible one. Because for the region, that is not a question of dates anymore. And I think that that was a mistake from the EU side and from the last promise that we heard from the President of the Commission. I think that's a process of transformation. And whenever we are transforming our societies, then I don't think that anybody will really mind about the date of the accession.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brego. I'd like to thank our panelists who have given us very good answers, especially those who have participated in 2 panels. The next panel on the Middle East will be beginning shortly. We just have a little bit of furniture to rearrange, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The next session is about to begin.
Two lectures. We're not too bad. It's not the end of the world if we're not. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us into the afternoon. Hope you're having a wonderful conference so far. My name is Kevin Barron. I'm the executive editor of Defense One, a news website that's free and paywall free, and I hope you all visit. That covers the Pentagon. In short, I'm a Washington reporter. I'm a Pentagon reporter. I'm also your moderator here for four people that I'm sure you prefer to hear from far more than myself. I'll give a brief introduction, and then we'll have some keynote remarks. We'll come back, we'll have our panel, and we'll have a nice discussion that I hope you all jump in and be lively and interesting and useful and challenge us all. So this session is Security Architecture in the Middle East, Building on Sand with a question mark. When we have our four panelists, His Excellency Anwar Mohammed Gargash, Minister of State for Foreign Affairs of the UAE, Nasser Judah, the former Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Jordan, Ambassador Cameron Munter, President and CEO of East-West Institute, and Mirek Dušek, the Deputy Head, Center for Geopolitical and Regional Affairs at the World Economic Forum, Davos, to you and I on Twitter. With that, we'll invite His Excellency Gargash to come give keynote remarks. I think they're about 15 minutes, and I will join you on the other side of that. Minister.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very happy to be here in Bratislava. Last year in my speech at this conference, I reflected on the irony that the UAE, thriving economy, capable of erecting the world's tallest building, was situated only a few miles away from Iran's belligerent theocracy. Recent events and the very sensitive situation we face there have highlighted that irony again. If last year I directed your attention to the height of the Burj Khalifa, let me this year lift your eyes even higher to project that is literally astronomical in scope. For it is our intention next year to launch a probe to Mars named Hope, which will reach that planet's atmosphere by 2021, when our country will celebrate its 50th anniversary. This will not in itself be a unique achievement, although no country of our size has yet attempted anything of this kind. What is important about this mission is the message that it sends, that Arab countries can be just as progressive, just as global in their outlook, and just as ambitious for the welfare of their people as any other, despite the chronic instability of our region. The Hope mission is at the core of what the UAE is attempting to do, to create stories of success, aspiration, and positivity that can shatter stereotypes, inspire our region, and stand as a counterpoint to the brutal, backward ideologies that drag it down. It is therefore fits well with the theme of the World Expo, which Dubai will host next year, Connecting Minds, Creating the Future. This slogan emphasizes global cooperation, a focus on education, and the advancement of the mind and the worldview that is focused on the future and not the past. 192 countries have announced their participation, making it the most inclusive and diverse expo ever. This theme of global cooperation and dialogue and openness to diversity was also reflected in the historic visit of His Holiness the Pope to my country this year. This visit, the first of its kind to the Arabian Peninsula, was a visible rebuke to extremists on all sides. And it coincided with the UAE's Year of Tolerance. It resulted in a document on human fraternity, signed both by His Holiness the Pope and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, which we hope can contribute to enhancing a much-needed spirit of peaceful and constructive coexistence between Islam and Christianity. The Pope's visit was not a one-off event, but the culmination of a policy we had practiced over 3 decades of promoting moderation and encouraging religious pluralism. The UAE plays host to 80 Christian places of worship, 2 Hindu temples, a Sikh Gurdwara, and a Jewish synagogue. While minority faiths are diminishing elsewhere in the Middle East, they thrive among us. The rocket that contains the Hope probe will be launched next year as a part of this strategy of openness and progress. The rockets that are aimed in our direction from some of our neighbors in the region, however, stem from a very different mentality. Iran's ballistic missile program is one facet of its behavior, which gives us grave concern. We Arab states and Israel have experienced the stabilizing effects of Iranian missiles and the threat they pose to peace. The nuclear deal signed in 2015 was a genuine effort to address one of the main concerns about Iran's behavior. But from our perspective in the region, it did not tackle this dangerous ballistic missile program or Iran's regional policies, which includes interference in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, and support for proxy forces, including the terrorist group Hezbollah. The JCPOA did not deliver a peaceful and normal Iran. Today we are faced with escalation in the region and a bellicose rhetoric from Iran, which continues to foster and use sectarianism as a means to insert itself into the Arab world. Our response has been peaceful. We have cooperated fully with US sanctions, which we hope will influence Iran's behavior for the better. We have also signaled clearly our willingness to engage with Iran in a more positive spirit. When Iran suffered floods earlier this year, we were happy to give humanitarian aid for the victims. Make no mistake, the current situation requires wisdom, patience, and de-escalation. Yet it is essential that Iran understand that its belligerent policies have not only been bad for the Arab world, they have also been bad for Iran itself. The Iranian regime have heard the message, I hope coming clearly and powerfully from the recent 3 summits organized by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, of the Gulf Cooperation Council Summit, the Arab League Summit, and the Organization of Islamic Conference States. These summits were a clear success for diplomacy. The majority of Arab and Islamic states sent a powerful message to Iran, cutting through the Iranian PR and rhetoric and affirming that states must act responsibly and respect sovereignty in their regional space. Those 3 summits provide a clear diplomatic framework for Iran to reassess its regional policies and understand that its current approach is a recipe for perpetual crisis. In Yemen, meantime, Iran's ally, the Houthis, have carried out rocket attacks on multiple civilian targets and on oil pipelines, a move designed to hold the world to ransom. They are also stealing food supplies from the local population, as the World Food Programme recently confirmed. The Houthis are guided by the same mentality of religious fanaticism that has beset our region in the past few decades. They are a theocracy on the lines of the failed Iranian model, and the Houthi system is similar in its way to the Caliphate promoted by Daesh. This is a group that has had too little scrutiny from those who rushed to condemn the Arab coalition in Yemen for a war which the Houthis themselves began. The Arab coalition, including the UAE, fully supports a political solution in Yemen and has actively done now for over a year. We are determined to end the military phase within a UN framework and ensure a process of Yemeni to Yemeni negotiations that will agree the future political system for the country. Yet it has become fashionable in some circles to condemn Arab Gulf states as warmongers. Some reputable media outlets even claimed, after ships were sabotaged in the vicinity of the Fujairah port last month, that this was somehow contrived by us as a manufactured excuse for escalation. Far from it. We have adopted a stance aimed not at escalation but at deterrence. In doing so, we have been very careful to ensure that investigation into these events is both thorough and inclusive, involving many countries that have an interest in maritime security and regional stability. We want an Iran that is at peace, that stays within its own borders, and abandons both its imperial ambitions and its aggressive nuclear program. And we want to achieve this outcome through peaceful means. Iran and its proxies represent an axis in our region. Not everyone who supports Iran does so out of religious belief, just as not everyone who supported the Soviet Union truly believed in communism. Yet they are all part of a system of alliances and proxies which ultimately empowers the Iranian regime, at whose summit is not Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif and not President Rouhani, but instead the country's IRGC generals and its supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. A second axis is composed of those Sunni Muslims who favor a similar menu of extremist political Islam. The Muslim Brotherhood and its sponsors do not have a supreme leader in the same way as Iran does, but they are equally dedicated to using religion and at times violence as a means to obtain and entrench their own power. Of course, this prospectus of religious rule requires the marginalization of those who belong to other faiths or those who want to take a more liberal attitude towards their own faith, a process that has helped deplete the Middle East of its vibrancy and diversity. Setting people of one religion or one sect against another is the most effective way for these people to prosper. Religious tension is the food on which these groups feed, and it is also what they produce. The UAE believes that while the international community has worked successfully to counter terrorism, we have not done enough in countering extremism. It is towards this goal that our next collective effort should be directed. In the face of these two axes of Sunni and Shia religious extremism, how can we build a security architecture that is cohesive and which can also, in the long run, be inclusive, so that it offers the hope that the Middle East, so plagued now with division, can be united in peaceful common endeavor? For the architecture of security in the Middle East not to be built on sand, it must be built on a threefold foundation of good economics, good politics, and deterrent security. We can build economic opportunity and give people jobs and aspirations, and we do. The UAE gives more of its gross national income in development aid than any other country in the world, and has given nearly $25 billion over the past 5 years to support the economies of other regional states. On that economic base, we can construct a political foundation of moderation, acceptance of diversity, and the rejection of extremism. This too, as I have discussed, is very much what we want to do. But underpinning the economics and politics must be the most basic foundation of all. The region must regain some measure of stability. Constant warfare engenders religious extremism. Revolutions and radical and sudden shifts of power rouse constant excitement and optimism among observers from outside the region. Yet for those who are on the roller coaster, who actually have to live with the consequences, this unpredictability is far more disturbing, painful, and dangerous. All too often, it ends by strengthening extremists and highlighting internal conflict. If we can offer stability, then we can proceed afterwards a little higher in the hierarchy of needs. On a foundation of stability, we can build a superstructure of moderation and cooperation. It can be done, and the UAE is a living example that it can be done. The emphasis on stability may perhaps seem paradoxical when I address an audience in Central and Eastern Europe, home of the iconic political changes that took place in the 1990s, as the Iron Curtain disintegrated and democracy and independence replaced Soviet rule. Yet there is a great difference between the revolutions that took place here, where a prior democratic tradition existed, and violent religious extremism did not, where a security umbrella was provided by NATO and economic prosperity was promised by the EU and the Middle East. It's a big difference. In our region, we will need a longer and different journey. The UAE's experience of its own development and of the wider region tells us that change in our region must come through evolution. That is not an excuse for standing still. We need to work hard at creating an effective governance model that can withstand the test of time. It does not need to be European or Far Eastern in its inspiration, but it should be a model that can bring justice, opportunity, and economic prosperity. So when we look at situations like Algeria and Sudan, where political transitions have begun by popular demand, we want to strike a balance in our approach, certainly not standing in the way of popular will, but smoothing the path to a peaceful outcome that enhances internal and regional stability, and whose precise nature and pace is for those countries and not us to decide. The great challenge in these countries, as we can see from the experience of the Arab Spring, is how can popular change be achieved while maintaining institutional stability. When we look at Libya, by contrast, we have concerns that the Tripoli government continues to have support from militias, some of which are extremist. Libya is a country of great strategic significance. It neighbors Egypt, the most populous Arab state, and instability that starts in Libya could spread there. It is also an oil-rich state. Imagine if Daesh, instead of the limited oil fields of eastern Syria and northern Iraq, had access to the far richer supplies of Libya. Here again, our emphasis is on the immediate ceasefire, as well as strong diplomatic support for the UN-led process and for a negotiated and non-violent settlement. Through this process, stability can be achieved in Libya, and prosperity and moderation can then be nurtured, bringing great benefits, of course, to Europe as well as the Arab world. So I would like to leave you with two messages. To those countries in Europe who already know us well, I'm not putting forward here a unilateral vision, but a vision of shared goals to make the Middle East an area of economic stability and prosperity. Let us approach these goals in a spirit of mutual respect and mutual dependence. We want us to consult together, not preach at each other. We don't seek to depend on you or make you pay for our security, but you still matter to us. The international system is shifting, but we still need our allies and friends, recognizing, of course, your own domestic constraints and politics. To those countries in Central and Eastern Europe who don't know us so well, we need to reach out and explain our policies, break stereotypes, and of course learn about your perspectives and policies. I hope that this conference will be a regular opportunity for us to do so, and that we shall have many opportunities to learn from each other. Thank you very much.
Mr. Minister, thank you for those remarks. I heard several themes in there. I hope our audience also caught with their ear. Let's see, we heard about variations on a theme of how to create a security architecture here when a region is not perhaps as divided as would look from the outside. I think for many years, many of us have heard the phrase the NATO of the Middle East, wondering when something like that was going to happen. It actually just came from Asia in another conference in Singapore where they're talking about the same thing, and they seem to always be talking about the same thing. But I think we heard everything from the Iran deal to relations with Europe to the outsider's perspective versus the local perspective on relations and some of the obstacles to creating newer security architectures for the future. So let's get your perspectives. And I'll start, Minister Judah, we'll start with you. We'll go by rank, I think. You may have heard a lot of this before. What's new now, and what do you see in the near future and for the longer future that we just heard when you think of the immediate happenings? So what I mean by that is Minister Gargash is saying that this current situation with Iran requires wisdom and patience and de-escalation. Is that something that we're seeing right now when the Americans are sending an aircraft carrier and bombers to the region, and the rhetoric out of the White House is as hot as it's ever been, on one hand, but at the same time, you're hearing, well, war is not what anybody wants. So what's the situation that you see in front of us today?
Thank you very much. Well, you've summarized it pretty well. I mean, there are mixed signals coming out, one of an escalatory type rhetoric, and the other is trying to ease the tensions. We all need to have a de-escalation on that front. But let me, if I may, just start by saying that the title of this session is the Regional Security Architecture, Building on Sand, as if we're talking about building on sand necessarily implying that anything that is built on sand is shaky. Let me just be playful and remind people that I come from Jordan, and one of the new wonders of the world, Petra, was carved out of sand. And we have the baptismal place of Jesus Christ, also on sand on the banks of the Jordan River. If you stretch, and thousands of religious and historic and archaeological sites on sand, the birthplace of Islam in Mecca and Medina was built on sand. Minister Gargash spoke of the Burj Khalifa, and that's built on sand. Let me go back to Egypt.
That one I hope is built on something stronger than sand.
Well, exactly. Well, I think that if you go back to Egypt and the pyramids, so you can build on sand and have solid structures. So the regional security architecture of the region does not necessarily have to avoid being built on sand. It is already on sand, and let's try to see how we can improve the networking on that. Again, when you talk about the region, again, I'm trying to just dot the I's and cross the T's. If you're talking about, what region are we talking about? Are we talking about the Arab countries? Or are we talking about the region as a whole, which includes Turkey and Iran and Israel? Or are we talking about outside powers that also have a stake in what happens in the region, like Russia and the United States? And of course, you know, the role that our closest neighbor plays historically, which is Europe. And when you're talking about Europe, there's not just one Europe. The Europe that we're talking about is not just the European Union. And that maybe can apply to our part of the world. In the past, I think that our region as a whole was famous for exporting tension and exporting trouble to the rest of the world. I think it's a two-way street now. It's what happens in one region has ramifications on the rest of the world, especially when you're talking about radicalization and extremism and terrorism. So we have many issues in the region. Minister Gargash referred to several of them. There are more. There are serious socioeconomic challenges. There are political conflicts. There are military conflicts. There are issues of migration and refugees. I think all of this has to be addressed comprehensively. I'll go back to that, but one great historic example, which may not have been perfect, but certainly was on the right path. If you remember, in the mid-70s, in the height of the Cold War, we were talking about a conference on security and cooperation in Europe, which later translated into the Helsinki Accords and the OSCE. An eminent personality from Jordan once said, why can't we have an OSCME, security and cooperation in the Middle East, where we can put aside our differences, whether they're political or otherwise, and sit and talk about issues that relate to threats and challenges to the whole region, in spite of political and other differences, or ideological differences, and they are there. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll come back to that if you wish.
Well, let's send it down the line to Ambassador Munter. So you said backstage you can talk about American policy perspectives. So there's a lot to pick in there, and I'll give you two to choose from. Either you can talk about the Iran, the continuation of the Iran, tension that we're in now, or this question of Yemen that was raised in the keynote address. And on that particular note, I was glad to hear the minister mention or characterize this as the outside world rushing to condemn the Arab coalition that's fighting the Houthis in the Yemen conflict. So I'm a defense reporter. I've covered this longer than I think most Americans had even known it existed. Most Americans found out about that conflict after the Khashoggi killing. And then somehow that became a catalyst for opposition to American involvement in the war and Saudi involvement in the war and to President Trump and to probably to UAE at a lesser degree, without much discussion about the conflict and whether or not it itself is an actual security benefit to the United States. So you've got that question on one hand, or you've got the United States in the region with an aircraft carrier and B-52 bombers, specifically, as the president says, as a deterrent for all the Iranian misadventures that was described in the speech as well. Either way, those are not two good options for Americans in the region.
Well, what I'll try to comment on, less on the details of that, because I think you know those much better than I do, but a better sense would be trying to come to grips with an understanding about architecture, understood, whether it's on sand, whether it's on water. The kind of architecture issue that I think is very important is to focus in the Middle East on the fact that it's the export of domestic policy. That is to say, under President Trump, more than any of the people since the establishment of the Carter Doctrine, you have an explanation of the way in which America is engaging in the region based on domestic policy. When you have a ban on Muslims, it's not about Muslims. It's about domestic policy in the United States. Moreover, these notions that we are trying to build a security architecture, those kinds of discussions about an OSCE or other kinds of multilateral institutions that are sadly missing in the region, or putting together a way in which there can be mitigation of the conflict, whether it's Yemen, whether it's Iran, is best understood by the fact that there is very little of the grand strategy being discussed in the United States. There is, of course, what's being discussed by the professionals in the national security world in the Pentagon, based on traditional alliances, based on American interests and the bases in places like Qatar or the naval stations in Bahrain. But these are primarily domestic issues in the United States. Therefore, when you look at the problems that were raised by the speaker here, what we have is an attempt by a president who is looking to his constituencies at home to try to reflect overseas what will make him be able to pursue his own policies. When you talk about the Middle East, and I am talking about not just the Arab world, but the neighbors as well, when you talk about the remarkable relationship that has grown between Israel and Saudi Arabia, the remarkable spin-off that has for the countries of the Gulf, for Jordan, for Egypt. What we're talking about is a reflection not only of the efforts of people of goodwill in the region to try to work together on issues, but of a very strong domestic consensus in the United States that that's what President Trump should do. Likewise, when you look at the very strict rejection of the JCPOA And everyone knows, just as in the remarks before, there were many flaws to the JCPOA. That was not something that was able to deal with Iranian behavior beyond its borders or with ballistic missiles. It wasn't intended to do so, but indeed it did not. The point about the rejection of the JCPOA from Donald Trump was, I'm going to get you something better. The difficulty is getting something better is very hard. And the question is whether, in the effort to recognize that a domestic constituency did not like the JCPOA, the question that is raised is not only the challenge of going with Iran beyond its current behavior, but is it possible internationally to come up with a bigger security architecture, some sort of way of dealing with Iran that goes beyond the traditional way in which Trump speaks of bilateral crisis. That brings me, I guess, to my best answer to your question on Iran. If what you're looking for is an attempt to try to get Iran to, I think the phrase they use in the Pentagon is to change its calculus. If you're looking to change its calculus by trying to put aircraft carriers and bombers there, I am not convinced that is something that can change a calculus. It may be something that can garner support among allies. It may be something that can make sure that Iran in some way is contained, but I would argue more than anything else, it's a means for Donald Trump to try to seek to be reelected in 2020. Domestic politics drive that policy. Similarly, I think that it's a less cut and cleared question about Yemen, which, as you say, is not in the forefront of policy in the United States. Very few people really do follow the complexities of the Yemeni struggle. But once again, the solidarity that the United States wants to show to the Saudi effort to fight in Yemen is a great part of why it is developing in the way it is, and why America is seen in at least in domestic terms, as struggling in Yemen and trying to figure out how to deal with what could be a really disastrous, potentially in terms of a humanitarian disaster, could be a terribly disastrous situation. So my point is simple. What I'm trying to say is, as we think of the architecture of the Middle East, I would urge you not to look at it in the classical sense of what a NATO planner would do, or what the Pentagon puts together, or what Zbigniew Brzezinski would put together as a grand strategy. We are dealing in an era now where there's a primacy of domestic politics. What that also leads is one other fear that I would have, and I hope that you would be able to mitigate that, is because of the magnitude of this change in the thinking in the United States, there's a tendency by some in the region to think the Americans are leaving, and that the calculation is that because America is not approaching security in the manner that it did previously, that it's an all or nothing proposition. America's pulling out. Neither is that the case. And that's where our friends in the Gulf and our friends throughout the world, I think, have a very difficult job trying to figure out what of the American overall strategic approach is essentially coasting from what came before, and what is the radical change that I put at the feet of President Trump, that he is exporting American domestic policy, and that what we see in the Middle East is a result of that calculation.
Well, thank you for that. I would say I wouldn't put it at the feet of the president. I'd put it at the tweet of the president.
At the tweet of the president.
You never know
exactly,
what
yes.
we'll get. Well, your remarks are a nice lead-in to mirror, because I think, as you said, the American relationship is so focused on kind of two things right now. It's all or nothing with Iran. This presidential administration's focus is to put a lot more attention on the Iran problem for Washington, and it's not about grand strategy. Not that it maybe ever was for lots of people. They always want more of that, but it's not about things that are other than hard security, other than aircraft carriers and American troops and bases and counterterrorism missions against groups like ISIS. Beyond that, there are many other ways to skin a cat. There are many other ways to get to a greater security architecture. What are your thoughts?
No, absolutely. I've worked at the World Economic Forum on the Middle East for 12 years now. So I get to work with government leaders, I get to work on geopolitics, but I also get to work with business leaders. I get to work with young people. This is the demographic majority of the region. So I'm really I have the pleasure to have some kind of a 360 view of an outsider, but still quite useful. And through our work, at least, we have uncovered really a tale of two regions. Somehow connects to what Minister Gargash was saying. Imagine two regions, two systems, one forward-looking, characterized by very forward-leaning governments that are into digital, characterized by one of the best companies in the world. I don't know how much you know about the region, but there are some of the outstanding companies out there. Some of the best startups recently are springing up from this region. So that's one. Then the other is what I would describe as the legacy system. Imagine a bloated public sector that overemploys people. Imagine sclerotic institutions. The average individual in the Middle East would arguably encounter both systems wherever you live, but it is the proportion. And that brings me to how it connects with security. I would submit to you that it really starts at home. It's really about the interaction between the legacy and the forward-looking system. We need to make sure, and to help, or the decision makers in the region are really introducing reforms to enable the forward-looking system to take off, if you will, because the gravitational forces of the legacy system are quite strong. That is the 360 that I would see, and it is connected to security. But even if you take the forward-leaning system, there is a tax on operating right now in the Middle East. Let me illustrate that with one statistic. There are two ride-hailing companies that one is in the US, one is in the Middle East. Lyft, you may be familiar to those of you, just IPO'd in April for $23 billion. Karim, which operates in the Gulf, got acquired by Uber for over $3 billion. They have the same amount of customers, roughly. And so if you talk to people about the difference, why is it such a difference? Well, they tell you it's the scale of the market, it's too fragmented. And so the tax is really about the fragmentation of the region, which holds back the region from realizing its full potential. Internally for the region, it's really about looking at the home front and really enabling the forward-looking elements to really win this, if you will, both among nations but also within nations, frankly. The other thing I think we need to realize, I work a lot on global risks and the geoeconomic picture right now in the world, and a lot of people talk about multipolar world and things are changing, and but there is also this thing that we call multi-conceptual world that we are now seeing because of the lack of certain hegemony. We are seeing these different values, historical experiences, different future outlooks to really come to the fore of international cooperation, and it has impact on this region as it has impact on Europe and elsewhere. So it is, right now, we are living through this multi-conceptual moment in the world, which I think is a drag on also the opportunities in the Middle East and North Africa to really achieve this grand vision of what this title suggests, of an architecture, a new architecture for security in the Middle East. Having said that, I don't mean to say that there should be paralysis or we should give up. I think it's really about looking at what kind of outcomes we want in the region. So it's this outcome-oriented collaboration that is more really based on what we want to achieve, what are the interests that certain countries want to achieve, and how do we get there. So in many ways, there are opportunities to look for new ideas, but I don't think we should be held back by certain concepts of grand architecture that needs to take place before we can move to anything. I would just like to finish with one thing, which is the digital economy, because we are rapidly moving to the digital economy. It's about 4% right now of the overall economy of the Middle East is digital. I mentioned startups. A lot of the traditional family companies, real estate companies, and others are moving to digital aggressively in the Middle East as well. But then it's about cyber. So how do you secure this economy where more of our data and more of our services and other things reside? And you may not remember that, but now we are all talking about cyber. We remember the Maersk and other big cyber disasters recently. But in 2012, it was Saudi Aramco that actually got attacked. It was a prelude to a new era, if you will, of the realization that as we move to the digital economy, we're also really confronted with this need to figure out cyber and cybersecurity. And there is no turning away from the digital economy because it has a huge potential. So really investing in this is important because there is one crucial difference in cyber. It's very, very hard. We've done, you may know, the World Economic Forum has a Center for Cybersecurity. We've done some work with experts. It's very, very hard, even for the best of agencies, to figure out the attribution of attacks. And so this just increases asymmetry of warfare in this space. And so the potential for further destabilization is just much bigger because it just democratizes the space for other unsavory elements to operate there. So just an appeal that this should be high on the radar screen.
Amerigo, that's an excellent point to get to cybersecurity as well as the traditional hard security, because I'm going to give myself one more question before we turn to the audience. Remember, you can use Slido to get a question in if you like as well. But to go back to the ministers, Minister Gargash, in your speech, you said the future architecture should have three aspects: economics, politics. The third was deterrent security, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that. What did you mean? Are these what part of that could lead to some physical, an agreement, whatever it may be for the architecture? In my hard space, we hear a lot about a missile shield, for example, or an interoperability between nations' militaries, or common capabilities going forward, including more counterterrorism capabilities in the region. We just heard about cyber as well. Maybe cyber is the one that kicks this into a new era. What do you see when you mean when you talk about deterrent security?
I think it's really understanding that the international system has really changed. It's not the same international system. So clearly, a massive operation such as the operation to liberate Kuwait from Saddam's invasion is not really in the cards today. It's a very different world here. So clearly that leads you to building several what I would say layers of security. I think first is building your own capability. So clearly, countries such as the UAE and other countries here, Jordan's another good example, are aware that the first threshold for security is their own capability. So clearly, this is something that we have been building for many, many years. And as a result, we were part of the NATO operation, stabilization operation in the Balkans. We were part in the Afghanistan effort, etc. So you have to have a certain capability in my assessment. I think number two is really to recognize that when it comes to, as we've seen in the recent incident in Fujairah port, in the Fujairah area, you have to also understand that a global supply of global energy, and at the same time maritime commerce is an interest for a lot of nations. So clearly around that also you have to also build some alliances, and you have to be able also to depend on some of these alliances. Now the word deterrent is that this is not really a capability to escalate. It's a capability to deter, really. And I think also, as you mentioned, some of these things come with the new areas really of warfare in the region. For example, in the beginning of the Yemen crisis, we did not really see the same type of missile or drones until we started seeing Iranian missiles and drones being smuggled to Houthi targets, to Houthi militias. So clearly you understand also that the sort of capability that Hezbollah has, or the sort of capability that the Houthis have, is no longer static. So you also need to, as you mentioned, create some sort of defense against these capabilities. But again, I would say that the deterrent mindset is foremost political, and then it is capability. Number one, it's political. You have to have the wisdom, you have to have the foresight not to be dragged into a confrontation. And I think beyond that, you have to have the capability to, that if you are tested, either on your own or with some allies, regional or other, to be able to also create what I would call a credible threshold.
Thank you for that answer, and I'll key on what you're talking about. Building capability means arms sales, especially from the United States, where there's a changing appetite for that. And I'll get the ambassador's comments on that after we hear from Mr. Minister there.
A few quick points, if I may. First of all, in your introductory remarks, you said, reflecting on when you're going to see a NATO-like setup in our part of the world. That may be necessary to face a particular challenge, but I think what we need is something broader to look at the overall challenges that we face in the region. When it comes to Iran, okay, JCPOA dealt with the Iranian nuclear file, whether you agree with all of it, some of it, most of it, whatever. But I don't think there has been a multilateral effort to address Iranian intervention in the affairs of the region. And if you look at the map, you're seeing direct Iranian influence extending from Iran itself through Iraq, Syria, and of course into Lebanon and Hezbollah. And in the south, you've got Bahrain, Yemen, and across the Red Sea into the Horn of Africa and possibly beyond. I think there has to be at some stage, regardless of the current map, or the current dynamics that we are seeing, the escalation and the de-escalation and the volatile situation. I think what is needed in the future is some sort of a multilateral, a cohesive effort that tells Iran, this cannot continue to happen. And probably easier said than done, but this is something that I've also. I think addressing the political, economic, and social challenges in the region, which feed terrorism and extremism and radicalization. And I believe that political, economic, and social deprivation lead to despair, and despair always leads to extremism. So I think we need to address the various inequalities that we see there. Refugees and some of the burden that is borne by small countries like Jordan, for example, and I refer to it once as a global shared responsibility. I mean, just because you happen to be contiguous to an area of conflict where there's a humanitarian spillover, doesn't mean that you bear the brunt on your own. There has to be some global approach to this that we all subscribe to. In Jordan, we had a 20% increase in our population over a span of 18 months. No country, regardless of economic or political power, can cope with something like that. I always mention to my American friends, imagine if you had 66 million refugees landing on your shores in a span of 18 months, because that's the ratio that we're talking about. So I think that I really appreciated your point on companies and the innovation that we see in certain countries in the Middle East, in the Gulf, in Jordan. But innovation and economic prosperity and develop also require a safe and stable and secure political environment. And I think the two play into each other and should play into each other in a very, very harmonious way, which we don't have at this stage. And I think, again,
just a few minutes left now.
That's it. I'm done. I just want to say that I think we really need to look at some of the key challenges that are faced by all in some format or another.
we are down to just a few minutes, so brief questions, brief answers before I'll get to our Slido question. Ambassador, do you want to comment on the American political will for the arms sales that would be required for these kind of capabilities that they're just talking about?
So I'll keep it very brief because it's actually quite a complex domestic issue. But there is no agreement among the people in the United States that is on the kind of the America First model. The president tweets that many billions of dollars of equipment has been sold to country X or country Y as a sop to domestic followers. But this doesn't have a comprehensive support, say, in the American Congress on issues like Yemen, or you can find any number of other instances. So, no coherence that I can see emerging on arms sales. And one of the saddest things is when you think of the extraordinary impact that refugees have had, and you compare that to the amount of fighting that goes on in the American population, American government about arms sales, if just a fraction of the attention could be given to the plight of the refugees and what that has done to Lebanon, to Jordan, even to Turkey, then we would really begin to, I think, be getting at the issues that you talk about. I couldn't agree with you more. So once again, the arms sales, very, very contradictory and very much based on, at least from the White House, a sense of American advantage rather than strategic plan.
Thanks. I'll agree strongly with you that plus your previous answer, I think none of these issues are high on the radar in America right now, for better or for worse. And that's a whole other discussion, whether that's a good thing, that these are not things that are being argued about at the highest level immediately. We had an earlier Slido question that I think was just answered, asking about should the Arab states' position regarding Iranian aggression be more coherent? And we heard a call for a multilateral approach, perhaps even beyond that, but I think that's implied.
In an ideal world.
In an ideal world. We do have one audience member who has the microphone that I didn't see earlier, and I wanted to give him the opportunity to ask.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm Heinz Gärtner. I'm academic in Vienna. First, I want to say something about the GCPOA, where I was marginally involved going to the COPO, where it was negotiated for almost every day. And we got the impression that it was the best negotiated arms control agreement in history, which is 164 pages. It has a comprehensive verification system which does not expire.
Okay.
And
very briefly,
sorry. No, I come to my point.
Sorry.
I have to say this before. And also the treaty does not expire. Just read the preamble. If you include, everybody here said you have to, it didn't include political behavior. No arms control treaty in history includes political behavior, neither in the Middle East nor in Ukraine or somewhere else. When it comes to missiles, and that is my question, would you agree, especially I'm asking the two ministers, to set up regional arms control negotiations which address, involving not only Iran, but all the neighboring countries of Iran, addressing the question of the missiles, range and numbers, and maybe other conventional weapons, according to the model of the CFE in Europe, accompanied with confidence-building measures like the Vienna document?
Thank you. So brief answers.
I think the JCPOA was sold to us, and I followed this many times. I went to the State Department, followed State Department briefings, and I know that it is an agreement about nuclear capability, but it was also sold partly that it will actually ameliorate Iranian behavior. I think this was a major part of the selling component of the JCPOA. So let's be very clear about that. With regards to a regional missile arrangement, I think that is the way to go, to be honest, because clearly what we have seen in recent wars between Hezbollah and Israel, between flare-ups between Gaza and Israel, in Yemen and other areas, we can see that the future destruction in the region will be very much missile-based. And clearly, you know that many of these missiles are becoming more accurate, cheaper. So clearly, in an ideal world, the sort of regulatory regional framework for missile production and manufacture and use is something that has to be addressed. But right now, where we are today, the most menacing missile program is an Iranian one.
Okay, we're down to one sentence types of answers, as briefly as you can.
1.5 sentences. First of all, my friend, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think that on the JCPOA, fine. I said it was to meet a certain challenge, which is the Iranian nuclear file. I think in the future, and again, I emphasize, in an ideal world, we should see some multinational, multilateral effort to address other issues, not just political. Secondly, on strategic arms discussion in the Middle East, you're preaching to the converted. I mean, if you go back to my country's position, historically, we've been calling for a Middle East region completely free of weapons of mass destruction. Can you get everybody to sit at the table to talk about that?
Any final comments? No? Well, then, thank you for that. I think, as you heard, there are far more issues than we have time for today. But what I heard were many facets to this problem, many approaches, not one grand plan, not one grand strategy. Nobody's leading that anyway right now, especially not from the United States. We're very Iran heavy in our discussions at the moment. There are fractions to be dealt with. There's economic hope, though, in the future. There's cybersecurity that needs to go with that. There are plenty of ways that the countries that we're talking about can come together, should they choose to, but many challenges ahead. And you can continue to talk about them in refreshments, which is what follows this panel, I'm supposed to tell you, just inside the hotel. And the next session here in half an hour at 16:30 with Miroslav Lajczak, thank you, and Michel Barnier on Brexit. Forgive me, I just read that now. Thank you all for attending and listening to our panels, and thank the panelists for their time.
Good work.